It took the invasion of Ukraine for Europeans to realize that decades of short-sighted energy policy have caught up with them. As Germany strips its former chancellor of parliamentary privileges over his refusal to sever ties with Gazprom, Gerhard Schröder's downfall, a reminder that it's all of Germany and most of Europe that went for a quick buck by buying Russian oil and gas over the years. Meanwhile, France's second freak dry spell in 3 years in the spring, a reminder of that other existential threat to this continent, how we've mostly sleepwalked first into global warming and now into a climate emergency where water, not oil, could soon become the commodity we all obsess about. We'll ask about Europe's new €300 billion plan to speed up energy transition, one of several Green New Deals. The main question is how to pay for it. On a continent currently whacked by its worst inflation in decades, how much of the burden on taxpayers, on corporations, how much are we willing to sacrifice? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a Europe that's forced to speed up its energy transition. With us, Lola Valéjaux, Climate Program Director of the think tank IDRI, which researches and advocates for energy transition. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to Joseph Delatte, Research Fellow at the Institut Montaigne, the Montaigne Institute think tank. Welcome as well.
Thank you.
And we're also in the company of Fouquevin Nguyen, Research Fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute, which looks at all things European. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 2 summers ago, we reported on century-old homes in eastern France whose clay foundations were for the first time crackling because of drought. That is maybe just the beginning. According to the French government's forecast that's come out this week of a drought for the summer after a very dry spring. Look at this map. You can see that all the parts that have lines that are have those zebra lines on them. It's because they have suffered already lower than expected rainfall in the period from last September to April. The part that's in western France there, well, that's part of the breadbasket of this country. And of course, farmers are indeed worried.
This temperature is absolutely exceptional for the month of May because it's beating records compared to the normal seasonal average.
So it could be an outlier, but it's not so much of an outlier anymore, is it?
No, indeed, the current drought is more of a warning of what is already here, but what could become much worse if we don't aggressively cut down our emissions. The situation we're in now, having average temperatures above 1 degree compared to pre-industrial times is a result of our inaction to date on our emissions. And what we decide to do in the next 10 years is going to matter immensely on the future our children are going to see. So the next 20, 30 years are still within our reach to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. But what we do now is absolutely critical for our ability to cope with today's impacts and also determine what we're going to have to face in a few years.
And again, pardon the pun, but it is a perfect storm. We have at the same time the earth that's heating up and what's happening in Ukraine with Russia's invasion. If this is the new normal, then it's more than just a problem here in the land of the baguette and the croissant, where prices are soaring. Joseph Keane has more on that.
The global wheat crisis is having a big impact on French consumers. With the cost of the grain going up, it's having a knock-on effect on the price of flour and bread.
Notre baguette de tradition, qui est passée de 1,15 € à 1,20 € il y a environ 6 mois, d'accord. Et là, on va subir une nouvelle augmentation. Là, on l'a subi là, le 1er mai. Et donc, on est en train de voir parce qu'on sera peut-être obligé de remettre 5 centimes. Et c'est vrai que c'est pas amusant pour nous.
Customers are finding ways to adapt.
Si c'est 10 centimes, 20 centimes, ça va, on peut s'y faire. On fera des économies ailleurs.
C'est comme le gasoil, hein. Ça augmente et ça n'empêche pas de rouler.
France is the 5th biggest producer of wheat in the world, and it doesn't rely on imports. The country produces 35 million tons of wheat per year and keeps half for itself. The rest is mostly sold to European neighbours or North Africa. This wheat farmer has yet to sell all of his previous harvest. If weather conditions remain favourable, he hopes July's harvest will be sold at global prices.
Les grains se sont formés. On est monté à des cours du blé à quasiment à plus de 400 € la tonne. Je pense que c'est quelque chose qui va s'inscrire dans la durée.
In a crisis such as a major drought, France would be able to keep most of its wheat for domestic consumption. However, a drop in French exports would further shake global markets.
Alors la France est une exportatrice nette, a un rôle extrêmement important à jouer dans la sécurité des pays importateurs. Mettre un ban à l'export sur les origines françaises créerait une déstabilisation au niveau international peut-être sans précédent.
Experts say wheat prices are set to stay high for the foreseeable future.
A destabilized global grain market. We're already experiencing it with the blockade of Ukrainian ports.
Yes, of course, and it's not the only issue we face here. We also face the Indian subcontinent that is facing a heavy drought, whereas India is one of the major second, actually, producer of wheat. So the cereal question is going to be extremely problematic in the near future. Well, not maybe for developed world, but for some countries that are heavily relying on their cereal imports, like for instance Tunisia or Lebanon.
Morocco saying this Thursday that it's got enough stocks for 4 months.
Yes, 4 months. Can you imagine, like, if the price keeps soaring for some countries, it would be a very big and very life-threatening issue.
A life-threatening issue, and then we heard in that report, and I'll put it to you, Phuc Vinh Nguyen, ordinary citizens there talking about, all right, it's just a baguette, it's just a little bit more expensive, we can take it for now, but it is adding up.
It is indeed adding up, and the price of all commodities are going up. And we're in a situation right now where the price will remain high, most likely for the years to come. So we need to act really fast in order to shield the most vulnerable. And what is important to highlight is that the drought, the high prices of energy are one of the numerous wake-up calls we need to have in order to act, in order to tackle climate change. So right now the challenge is to make sure that we'll be able to go through the challenges we're facing with enough predictability to ensure that citizens and the most vulnerable one will be shielded as we must.
Yeah, droughts are also scuttling, by the way, the core of France's decarbonization strategy, the nuclear core of it. Already, half the country's aging atomic plants are currently crippled by maintenance issues. It was the front page story in Le Monde this Thursday. Now comes the drought, with low water levels reducing output already at the Blayais nuclear power plant that's near Bordeaux. Emmanuel Macron, in his re-election campaign, said nuclear is the answer. But of course, if there's droughts all the time, how's that going to work?
Well, nuclear isn't an answer in the short term, because it takes, 10 to 15 years to build new nuclear plants. So what we have to do right now is to understand that there will be most likely difficulty in order to produce power generation in the next winter. Why? Because we have some difficulties with our nuclear plants, and because the drought also affects hydroelectricity, and part of our electricity in France, more than 10%, is produced thanks to water, basically. So we need to understand that we'll have to reduce some of our consumption in order to be able to go through winter, especially with the high prices of gas and energy overall.
And the prospect of a summer drought is also in this country, just to give a bit of background, a big public health risk. Back in 2003, public services failed the elderly. Scores died alone in their homes during a summer heat wave. Loved ones and care staff were off on vacation. It was a big wake-up call at the time. What if there's another summer heat wave now? Doctors and nurses are sounding the alarm over staffing shortages. Many are burnt out by the COVID pandemic and either have on leave or have quit. And it's points to a bigger problem, is that there's been a disinvestment over decades, not just in France, but all of Europe, in public services. And so we're coming out of COVID. We have a war in Ukraine. And if we have big droughts, again, it's the strain is putting on the public health system.
Indeed, the resilience of the public health systems and the future climate also implies that we need to reconsider the redundancy that we have in the system. We've been for several years investing in a more efficient scaled-down system, and at times maybe it makes us less resilient. But I think we also have to take a broader consideration of what resilience means, and I think it's also anticipating the new normal of the fact that we have to be more mindful of the way we use energy. And instead of having rationing that is maybe imposed in a harsh manner, we also have to anticipate where we can save energy. So that it's not only a story about using less energy, but also anticipating where we don't actually need it. And there's a lot of usage right now which are not very efficient that we could do without.
Yeah, the calls to save energy is one aspect of it, but you do need investment, and that brings us to the heart of the matter, which is this issue of how you go faster with that transition. Now, there was one example given on Wednesday. The leaders of Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany made their way to Esbjerg, that's in Denmark on the North Sea, to announce offshore wind farms. They called it a giant green power plant to eventually provide energy to 230 million European households.
We want to increase our total offshore wind capacity fourfold by 2030 and tenfold by 2050, which means that we are able, the four of us, in delivering more than half of all offshore wind needed to reach a climate neutrality in the European Union.
So, on the one hand, you have the Prime Minister of Denmark talking up this massive plan to build these wind farms offshore. On the other, you have Lola here telling us to turn down the thermostat. What's Europe looking at right now?
Well, we need both. Obviously, we need both. We need investments in renewable energy. We also need, and especially in countries like France, to keep the current energy mix working, and that means nuclear energy at the moment. But keeping in mind that the investment needs money, you need to find solutions to actually find the money on that. And the European Commission has just announced yesterday, I think, like the Repower Europe plan with this 280 billion euro that is both connected to the Russian situation, but also to investing massively into energy efficiency and new renewable energy facilities. But that keeping in mind that it's not nearly enough to actually mitigate and to diversify from Russian energy. So we are facing a real challenge. A real challenge.
Let's talk for a second about this wind farm proposal. Because here in France, during the presidential election campaign, there were many candidates, not just on the fringes, but mainstream ones, who were against wind farms.
Indeed, and it takes education, if you want my opinion, to actually explain to people that wind energy, and especially offshore winds, is part of the solutions for renewable energy, indeed in France as well.
And you mentioned that plan. It was unveiled on Wednesday by the European Commission. It's called Repower EU, 300 billion euros to make the EU independent of Russian fossil fuels as quickly as possible, says Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president.
Energy savings are the quickest and the cheapest way to address the current energy crisis. We will therefore increase the EU energy efficiency target for 2030 from 9% to 13%. Then there is the massive investment in renewable energy, the biggest task. Here we are increasing our target for 2030 from 40% renewable energy to 45% renewable energy.
So ambitious goals set out, and by the way, they're bringing forward the deadline. It's easy to promise stuff that's going to happen in 2050 when you're a politician. But for instance, that wind farm project, it's by the end of the decade, so it's in fairly short term. But when you hear these ambitious goals, it brings up the question that you heard from Joseph earlier: is how you pay for it. We've had a French president, while running for re-election, saying the end of whatever it takes to spending during the pandemic, that's soon going to come to an end. But it doesn't sound like it when you hear Ursula von der Leyen.
Well, you need to put into perspective that the fact that since the beginning of the war, we've already sent 50 billion euros to Vladimir Putin thanks to its fossil fuels exports. So right now, the plan that we are trying to make it happen at the European level is really ambitious and will require money, but it will also save money from sending it to Vladimir Putin and financing the war in Ukraine, which is the first step. Then the money that is being given to industrials, European industrial, will help create jobs also, which is kind of important for the reindustrialization perspective in Europe overall. And finally, you can also assume that the cost of inaction when it comes to climate change is always bigger than.
So how do you calculate that? How do you calculate, because you just said that the cost is offset by the fact that you're creating jobs and thus you're creating growth as well?
It obviously is a long-term strategy. You can't expect having economies and savings at the short term, but in the long term, when you see what can happen if we were to go beyond 2 degrees, well, the IPCC report is quite clear about that. We'll need to adapt our infrastructure. It will be enormously costly. Then that's why we have to act right now. That's why we have to deploy renewables as soon as possible to save money in the short term and to, in the end, try to innovate and create jobs in the long term.
Is money not an issue?
Well, right now, the investments we've already made in renewables are actually saving us money because we're currently in an energy price crisis where gas has increased 15-fold in the space of a few months. So every renewable we have as an asset, an increasing deployment is going to save us further money, as well as investing in demand-side measures, as we've already discussed. The key question is actually meeting our targets. And we could speak about France's case, which has been very timid in terms of setting itself targets in the future. We've missed our...
Why is that?
We've missed our current targets by a mile. They were relatively ambitious compared to our European partners, but we've really missed them because we're just not speeding deployment of solar and wind farms as much as we should, and we have no single offshore, which is crazy when you look at our geography.
We saw last year there was this a court case that the French government lost, environmentalists lodging it, a lawsuit basically for not meeting those climate targets. Why haven't there been more solar panels and wind farms?
I think partly it's been hinted before. There is a cultural issue right now, and I fear that it's going towards a political marker to be against wind farm in particular and its supposed effect on landscapes. But I think beyond that, there's maybe just a timidity in supporting renewables at the highest level of political power. And I think we should be much more blunt in supporting them. I think even having bold objectives really send a signal to the developers, and there are a lot that could be done in terms of speeding up the regulations to ensure that we have the renewables we need. But I think you build acceptability for more renewables if you also show that you manage the energy that you produce, because it's going to be used for things that are actually needed. And as we continue wasting energy in some usage which are not efficient and not actually needed, then we're not also building support for deploying renewables.
France's re-elected president, Joseph Delatte, has just named as prime minister a woman who's a former environment minister. He says he's going to focus more on social and environmental issues coming up. We heard in the proposals that were put forth by the European Commission president on Wednesday, things like what the Germans put in their government platform, solar panels on big industrial buildings, a call to lower the speed limit. And under Macron's first mandate, the speed limit was actually raised back to 90 kilometers an hour on main roads. Do you see Emmanuel Macron doing what Ursula von der Leyen wants?
Well, he has to do it. I mean...
He has to do it?
Well, I mean, he has to act differently. He has promised like this ecological planification that is going to be something very new in his government at the moment, and he will have to act differently and to be more ambitious. But we will all have to be more ambitious at the European level and the international level as well if we want to reach the target of the Paris Agreement. So, in terms of being more practical, we need a higher carbon price. we need to change habits, and to change that habit, it means like when you consume a product, you need to have like the incentive to consume a product that is produced with lower carbon content.
And how do you offer that incentive, and how do you not unfairly punish the people we saw in that report at the outset who are looking at the pennies in their pocket when they were buying a baguette?
Yeah, you are very right. That's called revenue recycling. You need to use the revenues of this carbon price and reintroduce it with maybe like social expenditure on that.
Phuc Vinh Nguyen, what's been the bigger turning point? The warming weather or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
Well, most likely the invasion of Ukraine has sped up the process. But what you need to remember is that before the invasion, the European Commission had already settled and unveiled a plan in order to highlight and accelerate our climate objectives. We were in a position where we wanted to reduce our greenhouse gas emission by 55% by 2030, which is really ambitious. And right now we're in a situation where we're going to accelerate in terms of deployment of renewables and in terms of energy efficiency, which is kind of remarkable from the European point of view.
I'm sorry, I take exception to that because yes, if you look at the last 10 years, the amount of carbon emissions in Europe has gone down.
Yeah.
But it's gone up by, I don't know, something like 300% in places like India and China. And effectively, we've outsourced our industry there. So how do you calculate how your carbon footprint is going up or down?
Well, what we need to understand is that thanks to Europe right now, most of the global world economy is committed to carbon neutrality. Actually, more than 80% of the world global GDP has committed to carbon neutrality, such as China, such as other countries that are really carbon emissive like the United States. And here is the first step, because when everyone commits, then everyone has to adapt its own economy. In 2040, we'll use carbon-free steel, which is produced thanks to green hydrogen. And then China will have to adapt. And then there's a race that is going on right now. It's a race in order to be ensured that we'll be able to innovate. And this is an opportunity for the French and the European government to establish a new capacity and new companies that will be the front runners of tomorrow's carbon neutrality world.
Lola Valéger, do you share the optimism of Phuc Vinh Nguyen that Europe, with 5% of the world's population, is setting the tempo on this?
You can absolutely do the same argument for every country in the world, except maybe China, which by itself weighs nearly 30% of global emissions. It's true that because of its historical responsibility in emissions to date and because of its current positioning, Europe is uniquely placed to have this leadership on climate action. We know it's not going to come from the US because we see how difficult it is for the Biden administration to pass meaningful legislation. So Europe really has to take a stand. And if Europe doesn't stand for climate action when it's challenged by the Russia-Ukraine war, how can we expect countries with much lower levels of development like India and China to make significant efforts to transform their economies while lifting their population out of poverty?
We live in a globalized world, and European corporations answer to shareholders that are around the globe. And what shareholders want is to make money. What you're talking about costs money.
No, I refute absolutely that word, because I think we have to view what we spend related to climate action as an investment and not as a cost. It's an investment for our future, and it's an investment for a better society. I think there's a lot of well-being benefits that could come also from investing in greening our economies. In terms of, you mentioned health, but air pollution is a huge issue in Europe and even more so in emerging economies. And there's a lot of innovation and potential for jobs that could come up from Europe if it really goes forward with its plan of European Green Deal. I think it's a unique moment in Europe's history to show leadership for such a critical issue.
Well, this week, French economics think tank Rexecote warned of the price of decarbonization, saying it would be stiff, in fact, very stiff. It said that between now and 2030, companies here in France, households and administrations must invest between 58 and 80 billion euros a year. That's the equivalent of 2.1 to 2.9% of GDP annually. It is a huge sum of money for a country like France, 50 to 80 billion euros, Joseph Delatte. So again, is this the way that Lola's describing it? Is it an investment that everyone will accept gladly, or is it a cost?
Well, it's definitely an investment, but it's definitely also a cost. So what we should have, I mean, like, we haven't spoken about the carbon border adjustment mechanism accounting for exported emission. Well, that's a clear measure that we need. We need to set an ambition also for the emissions that we export by buying products that are cheaply produced in developing countries, especially like countries like China. We need to have international agreements enhanced compared to what we have at the moment. We need to have we've seen a discussion on climate alliance, on sectoral issues, but also, for instance, on recognizing different measures to pricing a certain product, and that's really what we need. And to answer your question on the cost and the investment and the money that France, the country like France, need to invest. France is not isolated. I mean, there are also all the other European countries has to invest money on their economy. And as my colleagues here on the right said, I mean, the first mover will have a competitive advantage.
And right now, though, it is daunting when you look at these numbers. I mean, we've just come out of what was it? A decade of telling us that we need to watch the bottom line, and now the money's there. It can be done easily. I mean, how does it work?
I mean, I think we're already investing huge amounts of money in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have huge recovery package. And I think Europe has come together like never before in having coordinated action and a joint strategy. And it decided to put the Green Deal, so its political project for a carbon neutral Europe, at its center. So it's an incredible opportunity. Member countries have the possibility to cash in on those funds, provided they give plans which are sufficiently detailed on what they want to use them for. So there is a lot of European money that can be used. The question is, where are countries going to direct it? And I think this communication makes it much clearer in terms of what's expected of countries to deliver on the European targets.
Phuc Vinh Nguyen, there are the countries that have already spent their post-pandemic recovery fund. There are those countries that don't need it, by the looks of it, like Germany. And there are countries that still haven't gotten their money for various reasons. How's this going to work, you think?
Well, those types of countries have different issues right now. And if you take, for instance, Germany, as you talked about, even Germany will have to make massive investment in renewables in order to secure its energy system overall, because it has been really reliant on Russian fossil fuels. And overall, it will have to adapt its own economy. And this is where the EU is really important in order to ensure that the money we invest is also invested towards climate goals, and not only towards just getting rid of fossil fuels and replacing it by liquefied natural gas that is coming from the US, for instance. We need to have a clear strategy at the European level that we ensure that the investment we make are also compatible with the Green Deal ambition. And that's why the European Commission communication of yesterday was really important, because it laid down a strategy that is really reliant on investing in green investments.
And how's it going to end for countries like Hungary, which not only are at loggerheads with Brussels over rule of law issues, but also rely greatly on Russia? They don't just import gas via pipeline, they import oil via pipeline.
Indeed, countries like Hungary will have to face various challenges, and that's where solidarity will come from at the European level. If you want to put in place an oil embargo, for instance, we'll have to help them modernize their infrastructure. We have to help them with the neighborhood countries to supply some of this missing oil, and we also have to help them with the economy that will be impacted by those kind of sanctions. And only with that we'll be able to keep Hungary on board and help them also reach the climate target that are being settled.
There's a sort of Damocles over everyone's head, Joseph Durante, and we saw it with Bulgaria and Slovakia getting their Poland getting their natural gas cut by Russia. Russia could turn off the tap anytime it wants to the rest of the continent.
Yes, indeed, it's a very security threat that we are facing nowadays in Europe. But let's not forget that Russia is also heavily dependent on its exportation of natural gas to Europe. I don't think the Kremlin can afford, financially speaking, to completely turn the tap. If it does that, it will face probably we're getting closer to bankruptcy.
Do you agree with that?
It's definitely a risk. I think what's interesting compared to what we were discussing earlier is that historically in climate action, the Eastern European countries, called Visegrad countries, have been really reluctant to push for aggressive climate action because they were using this argument of energy security. And right now we see a realignment for these countries where energy security actually means getting off fossil fuels. And it's unprecedented, and it really shifts the balance of power and
even
balance
Poland,
of
which has a big coal industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's definitely opening much more of a space for discussion for acceleration. I mean, first, all these countries are still within EU and have signed up to the collective targets, but in practice, implementing, deciding what measures were going to look like was really tricky. So this Ukraine-Russia war means that these countries now see their interests much more aligned with ambitious climate action, and it's a big opportunity for pushing forward.
A big opportunity for pushing forward. When you look at the projects we've been discussing right here, they're big infrastructure investment projects. How much of the burden is on the private sector currently?
Well, the burden is pretty heavy. But if the private sector have the correct incentive, the private sector will invest. But I want to just follow up on what Ms. Vallejo just said. Sure, it kind of trigger and enhance the room for discussion for climate ambition, but we also face risk. The risk is the new investment that we make in unplanned fossil fuel power plants. For instance, the new LNG terminal that we will have in Europe to build in order to import heavily emissive LNG coming from the U.S. shale gas. But these assets are going to be stranded assets if we keep them afloat for the next 3 decades, for instance. It's heavy investment. We also face the risk that, especially from countries like Poland, to keep longer than expected coal-fired power plant, which could endanger in the future climate targets.
Because that's what we're discovering, isn't it? That when you make these kinds of decisions, you're locked in for decades. Indeed. And we saw Wednesday in the communique put out by the European Commission that it talked a lot about LNG, and so basically we're hooked on natural gas for a long time.
Well, we were hooked even before the Russian invasion. I mean, gas was part of the EU green taxonomy. It has always been a transition energy that was decided by the European Union. What we see now is that we are that hook that we need to import the gas from somewhere else. But this gas is not the same. It's shale gas. It's more emissive. It's come from by the sea, and it's going to be even more expensive, of course, because pipeline gas is easier to get than LNG.
Skyrocketing energy prices are the main driver for the inflation that we're seeing throughout Europe, and as electricity and home heating prices go through the roof, consumers can't help but look at the robust profits of major energy companies. Over in the UK House of Commons, the Prime Minister was asked Wednesday, this as inflation hit 9% in Britain, Conservatives resisting calls to make those energy giants pay.
We don't want to do it. We don't want want to do it. Of course we don't want to do it. We believe in jobs and we believe in investment and we believe in growth. And as it happens, the oil companies concerned are on track to invest about £70 billion into our economy over the next few years. They're already taxed, Mr. Speaker, at a rate of 40%.
So, Phuc Vinh Nguyen, I've always wondered this whenever energy prices go through the roof. Why do oil companies make such big profits when everybody else suffers at that time? What's the reason?
Well, basically, when the price goes up, they sell way more. The same volume that would have been sold for twice the price is sold way more to a costly manner. And that's why the situation right now is that we are wondering whether or not we are going to have windfall profits being taxed. And the situation is that some companies that are not respecting environmental climate objectives may be taxed way more in order to ensure that they concretely participate to the economy that we are seeing right now.
Are oil companies taxed fairly currently?
I think there's definitely a debate that's been opened at the European level for taxing what is called windfall profits. So it is the idea that you're just benefiting.
Because it's not just BP and Shell that are making a lot of profits.
No,
right
of
now.
course. And every fossil fuel producer is right now benefiting hugely from the current crisis context. And at the same time as the state is coming...
Benefiting why? Is it because they get to pass... Why do they get to pass on the price hikes to the consumers so easily?
I mean, even before the war, there was already a context of tension because arguably Russia was limiting its supply to artificially increase prices. So, of course, with the current war, then the prices have increased further, and that's true for all fossil fuels. It's natural that these companies want to pass on the cost to their consumers. The problem is when the rise are so high that many states have stepped in to shield the most vulnerable consumers, or actually, as in France, any consumer, from these price increases, then that begs the question, why should the state pay to compensate private citizens when the companies are actually getting immensely richer without having had any kind of strings attached to that money? So should we take some of that money in the pot to invest to lower our reliance on fossil fuels? That's a key political question today.
Joseph Doraté, if I understand correctly the reasoning of Boris Johnson, he's effectively saying the reason why we don't overtax oil giants is because they invest a lot of money and create a lot of jobs, and it's a sweetener we give them.
Well, that is stance. That is position on how market should work. Like less, not that many in regulation from the government, but following what has been said, it's a debate that should be done. We should have this fair debate of what to do with this big earnings from oil companies, for sure.
Is it a debate that's going to happen here in France, you think?
I think so. Inevitably, we will have to if you compare to the investment that are going to be necessary, not only into renewables but in decarbonization in general, we will need to have the debate to where to find this money, and that will be part probably of the solution.
Because when as was said there by Lola, when it's the French state that offers a subsidy to small homeowners, it's effectively taxpayers that are paying for it, in other words.
Indeed, and the issue is that you have to have better targeted measures to shield the most vulnerables. And right now, what we're seeing is that, for instance, oil is being incentivized, but everyone can benefit out of it. And what we need to do is to make sure that those that are the most in need, those that use their cars in order to work every day, that have a lot of issues with the fact that they can't have access to public transport, benefit the most out of it.
Is that doable? Is that possible?
It's doable, and an issue is that the energy price crisis started in October, and still we're in a situation when 6 months after that, we also have non-targeted measures, and that's why the government has to act really fast. And the legislative election will take place, and after that, in July, we'll have to implement measures that are really targeted to shield the most vulnerable ones.
And it is doable, you say?
it is doable. Some countries, like Austria, for instance, they have public transport measures that incentivize the takes of the buses, for instance. You have reduced costs for tickets for people that gains lower incomes, and these are the solutions that can be implemented really fast.
Joseph de Lattey was mentioning earlier how when you decide on energy policy, you're locked in for a long time, and we're still dependent on natural gas to a large degree, locked in for a long time if you decide to build a nuclear power plant, of course. That's half a century if you do it. But even making this switch to renewables, and I'll put it to you, Lola Valéjo, if right now we rely on batteries, and batteries, the stabilizing element in it is a rare mineral called cobalt. Most of it is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and most of it is mined by either Chinese companies or Glencore, the UK mining giant. So are we just shifting a dependence on one extraction industry for dependence on another extraction industry?
That's a very good question, and that's a real stake that we need to consider. Actually, the European continent has already started to think about a strategy to lessen its reliance for what are known as critical materials, such as cobalt, as you mentioned, but also copper and a slew of other rare earth
nickel, which
minerals.
comes a lot from Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a big question on how we're going to face this, and it's open. There's an interesting tension sometimes between the environmental goals and our climate objectives, and this is one of them. Mining is an incredibly polluting industry, yet we are considering for the first time to reopen mining in the European continent, hopefully with much better environmental safeguards than in other parts of the world, and a less polluting industry. But still, we're considering having more mining of these particular materials because we don't want to, as you said, shift our reliance to China, which transforms most of them right now.
Joseph de Lattey?
Yes, we are already over-reliant on China, especially for renewable energy capacity. I mean, if you look at where we are buying our solar panels, most of them are coming from China. We actually need China. We cannot make without China, especially if we keep this path to actually accelerate our dependence and our renewable energy production. But what is a big challenge that we are facing as for batteries is that this dependence is indeed dangerous geopolitically, because it could mean that the same dependence we have from Russia, but it's more an issue for bottleneck problem, because China itself needs to up its game in terms of solar panel and renewable energy, and still already at the moment we are facing in the supply chain for solar panel issues to actually provide European consumers, because Chinese keep their solar panel for themselves because they need them.
All right, we've seen initiatives like Elon Musk's Gigafactory in Germany, but why aren't there more of these kinds of
It is extremely expensive, and the money invested by the private sector also need incentive and also money from the public sector. And not every country has the capacity to actually invest that much money. Germany does it because Germany is the richest country of Europe. The European Union itself is trying to, as Lola Valéjo said, invest in new famous like batteries, Gigafactory. We have some factories built all around the continent, but will it be enough? Probably not at this moment. We need more of that.
So, Phuc Vinh Nguyen, thanks for telling us what the silver bullet is here.
Well, a tricky question here, but what we need to highlight is that it's a different kind of dependency if you compare it to fossil fuels. Because if you were to be cut from gas tomorrow, you won't be able to heat your home. But if you talk about nickel or cobalt, then it's used to build battery, but the battery is being then used in order to use it to storage energy and for electric vehicles, and the electric vehicles can still circulate on the road. So it's different, and you have more time to adapt overall in terms of strategy. And what's being important here that the European Commission highlighted the fact that they're gonna build up a strategy regarding raw materials and establish partnerships partnerships with countries like Chile, which has a lot of lithium, for instance, or Australia, which will help us reduce our dependence to countries like Russia, which are obviously not the best neighborhood at the moment.
Australia, which produces cobalt, sounds great, except again, it's not fantastic for carbon footprint. It's far away.
Indeed, but you're also able to recycle nickel or cobalt. When you have your battery at the end of the life cycle, you're able to take 10% out of it and make another battery out of it, which is kind of important in order to keep in mind the fact that we're going to be able to build a European industry out of it, and we'll be able to have a sovereignty overall regarding those kind of materials if we start now and we act smart.
One final question. The political uncertainty. In the case of Russia, we decided in 2014, after the invasion of Crimea, we at the time there wasn't this discussion. Mm-hmm. Why?
I think there was an appeasement policy and probably the idea that if we had strong links, in particular Germany, had strong energy links with Russia, then that would mean conflict would be impossible. We're now seeing that this was a calculation that was not correct, and we're now seeing the effect in full force. But what's more encouraging is that shortly after, the EU has set a compass for its transformation, which is the European Green Deal. And I think what's interesting is that in the various storms that we've gone through, be it COVID, being Ukraine war, so far, the EU still, sails the ship towards carbon neutrality, and I think that's an encouraging prospect and one that all member states should work towards.
All right, Lola Valéjos, seeing the glass half full. We'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Joseph Delatte, Phuc Vinh Nguyen. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.